We have come to a time in our service where we have a lesson from the Scriptures. And for more than a year now, we have been studying the Gospel according to Matthew. It is the first book in what Christians call the New Testament. And we have come this morning to the final major part of Matthew's Gospel. That's chapters 26 through 28. Now, if there's one thing that we have learned about Matthew's Gospel over the last year, it is that this Gospel is about discipleship. Now, if you're not very familiar with that word, discipleship, it just means that Matthew's Gospel is about learning from Jesus. Learning from Jesus, yes, how to live. Learning from Jesus how to think. Learning from Jesus how to feel. Learning from Jesus how to be human. Now, that process doesn't stop in this last part of the story. It can feel like that the last chapters of this gospel are simply a recitation of historical facts. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But actually, Matthew tells this story precisely because it is part of the good news. That's what the word gospel means. It means good news. And Matthew tells this part of the story because even though it doesn't feel like good news, it is. And he never loses his focus on discipleship. He never loses his focus on these fundamental questions of humanity. What does it mean to be human? How should we think and feel and perceive and act? What's really neat is that he doesn't just give us the example of Jesus. He gives us other examples too. Some of the most powerful examples are negative examples, and we're going to look at several of those this morning. But negative examples are thrown into sharper relief by positive examples. It's sort of like, if you're looking at a stained glass window, okay? The stained glass looks beautiful even when it's night outside. But when sun is shining through the stained glass window, you see all the shimmers, all the colors, all the facets of the artistry in that window. That's what Matthew does for us. After a brief introduction to what's going to happen, that's what we have in verses 1 through 5, we transition into the story that Natalia read for us this morning. And it describes for us a beautiful anointing. Jesus is at a dinner. He's reclining at table is how they would have described it in his world. And they didn't eat sitting at tables like what we have back here. What you would do is there'd be a low table, like even lower than, certainly lower than this one here, okay? And you would sort of rest on an elbow like this, and then you would reach over and grab food from the table and eat. And you would lay with your feet pointing outward, okay? That's how these eating arrangements worked. It's kind of different than maybe what we're used to. And so Jesus is at this table, and a woman comes. And she does something that is so loving, that is so insightful, that is so remarkable, that Jesus says she will be remembered for what she has done. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us who this woman is. Neither does the Gospel according to Mark. The Gospel according to John tells us that it was Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Now, what does that tell us? Now, because she is a woman, and this is a different world than the world we live in, she's not part of Jesus' inner circle of the 12 disciples. It's not part of his, what scholars call, professional inner circle. She is part of his personal inner circle. She's one of his closest friends because of her relationship with Lazarus and her sister Martha. And she has seen Jesus do something remarkable. And yet, Mary understands something. Maybe she doesn't fully understand it, but she understands something. That's what Jesus tells us. He tells us, hey, she did this for a very specific purpose. What was that purpose? To prepare my body for burial. It's almost as if Jesus is saying to her, or to his disciples, listen, you knuckleheads. I've been teaching you over and over and over again, this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. The religious authorities are going to arrest me. They're going to hand me over to the Romans. The Romans are going to crucify me. I'm going to die, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead. And you jokers haven't gotten it, but she has. But to me, by the way, that really does stand out, that she gets it. But to me, what really grabs me is just the tender devotion that she has. There are a million ways that she could have reacted if she really understood more than the disciples did about what was coming. She could have pled with Jesus to run for the hills. She could have gone to town and used whatever money she had to try to do the opposite of what Judas did, to try to bribe the religious authorities not to arrest Jesus. There's a million things that she could have done, but she did one thing. This act of loving devotion. And guess what? It was probably an act of real sacrifice. You see, this jar of ointment may very well have been her dowry. Now, we don't do dowries in our culture, okay? But in some cultures, girls don't inherit property from their fathers. So what they would do is they would give the girl a dowry. They would give her something precious. And it was something that she could take with her into the marriage. Now here's the problem. When she breaks that jar, and that's what you had to do with these alabaster jars to pour out the ointment, to pour out the oil. When you break that jar and pour out that oil, it's gone. Now she has no dowry. She is literally mortgaging her future on Jesus and for Jesus. Isn't that amazing? What kind of love does that take? What kind of faith does that take? Well, as we read this morning, the disciples didn't get the beauty of this act of devotion. And it's very interesting that it is this act of devotion that seems to finally motivate Judas to go and do something. To do something that maybe he had been thinking about for some time. But there's a lot of perplexity surrounding Judas's betrayal of Jesus. The first perplexity kind of is, what motivated him? What made him do this? Now, Matthew's gospel doesn't speculate on that at all. John's gospel tells us that he was greedy. But was it pure greed? Or was Judas also disappointed that Jesus was not the kind of, the Hebrew word is Messiah, the kind of Christ? That was how Greek sort of translated it. It was with the Greek word Christos. We just call it in English Christ. Okay? He wasn't the kind of Messiah, the kind of deliverer, the kind of Savior, the kind of rescuer that Judas was anticipating. Maybe that's part of what motivated him. Or maybe Judas was enraged by the supposed indignity of what this woman did. You see, in Jesus' culture, there were very strict boundaries between men and women. There are very strict boundaries, especially about interactions between men and women who didn't belong to the same family. And some people might have seen the act of this woman as somehow scandalous, as somehow inappropriate. And of course, Jesus is having none of it, But maybe that was part of Judas's motivation. Whatever his motivation was, greed was at least part of it. Because, again, this perfume, if it had been sold and quote unquote given to the poor, it would have been worth about 10 times, perhaps, what Judas paid or got paid for this betrayal. Maybe. It would have been worth quite a bit of money anyway. It would have been worth a year's wages. And all of that money would have gone through Judas's hands. He could have taken a pretty big stipend out of that. And who knows? Maybe this windfall, maybe people were starting to be onto Judas, and this windfall would have allowed him to cover up his previous thieveries. Who knows? Whatever the case is, whatever his motivations were, another perplexity is, what was Judas trying to accomplish? What was it that he was trying to achieve? Was he really just trying to get Jesus killed? Well, if so, why does he so quickly turn and change his mind? Why does he so quickly, if you turn over to chapter 27, verses, say 1 through 10 or so, you will see that Judas, once Jesus is betrayed, once he's actually under arrest and he's had his preliminary hearing and he's going before Pontius Pilate, the governor, for his trial, Judas is like, wait a minute, what have I just done? Why would he have so quickly turned? And okay, let's assume for a minute, maybe that wasn't what he was trying to achieve. Maybe what he was trying to achieve was to force Jesus' hand, to force Jesus to pull out his sword and start fighting the Romans. To call down angels. And well, if that's the case, that's a perfectly logical way for Judas to get himself killed. Because of course, who's the first person that Jesus, if he thinks like us, is going to take out? The betrayer. What these perplexities point out to us is that human behavior is very often not logical, especially when we start desiring to have something that we know we're not supposed to have, or something that we don't know how to obtain, something we don't know how to achieve. We will do things that are counterintuitive. In other words, they don't make any sense. We will do things that are counterproductive. In other words, they actually hurt the very agenda that we're trying to advance. All because we have been seized by forces in our mind and in our heart that are tearing us apart. Forces that are not good for us. And you know what John tells us? I think Luke does this as well, the Gospel of Luke. What they tell us is that this perplexity, this Judas losing his mind and doing something that makes no sense at all, was a direct result of Satan's influence. But here's the third perplexity about Judas. He knew better. He knew better. Not only had Jesus been telling his disciples, for quite some time now, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be killed. But then I'm going to rise on the third day. Don't worry about it. God is in control. We're going to get through this. No, not only had he been told that, but in some verses that we will look at in a couple of weeks, chapter 26, verses 17 through 35, Jesus actually tells Judas, hey, Judas, I know what you're up to. And this is going to turn out really bad for you. Judas had every opportunity to call it off. He had every opportunity to tell Jesus, okay, don't go to the Garden of Gethsemane tonight. Go the opposite way. Stay in the Kidron Valley or go anywhere else. Just don't go there. But he goes through with it. It doesn't make any sense. Then we have the religious authorities. And the thing that we see in them is just an ugliness. An ugliness. You see it from the very beginning of chapter 26. Look there at verses 1 through 5. Jesus tells his disciples, again, here's what's going to happen. And while he's telling them this is what's going to happen, the authorities, the powers that be, are meeting together and trying to figure out, okay, how can we get this Jesus fellow killed? And how can we do it in a way that is going to be least problematic for us, that's going to cause us the least issues, right? How are we going to do that? They're already scheming together. And then Judas shows up, and even though everything in their culture and everything in the Old Testament emphasizes the importance of loyalty, they are more than happy to help Judas betray his own loyalty for their own ends. That's verses 13 through 16. Then you finally come to the actual, what we'll call a preliminary hearing before the religious high council, who will decide whether Jesus is handed over to the governor or not. That's verses 57 through 75 of chapter 26. So you're getting way down there towards the end of the chapter. And what is it that we learn there? They just won't accept no for an answer. They don't have the evidence to bring a charge against Jesus, but they're going to keep plugging away at it, keep pushing, keep prodding, keep poking until they find something that they think they can use against him. But you know where we see this ugliness the most? It's back there at the beginning of chapter 27. I talked about this a moment ago, verses 1 through 10 or so. Judas, whatever is going on in Judas, he finally wakes up from his moral stupor and he goes, what have I done? And he goes to the religious authorities to show genuine remorse and to say, okay, now what do I do? He can't go to Jesus. Jesus at this time is already standing before the Roman governor. He can't go to Jesus and say, I messed up. I messed up. Help me, Jesus. I messed up. Can you forgive me? So he goes to the only people that he knows who can help him with this question of sin. He knows that he has sinned. And that means that he knows he has done something that deeply displeases God. So he goes to the only people he can think of, the religious authorities, the Pharisees and the priests. They, by virtue of their religious vocation, they're supposed to be the ones who will help him. What do? Judas shows up showing genuine remorse for what he has done, and their response is, yeah, that's your problem. It's not our problem. It's no wonder that Judas does something that is an act of absolute, abject, unmitigated despair. He throws the money into the temple that he had gotten for this betrayal, and he goes out and he hangs himself. Because he has no path back to God. Just this week, I was reading Michael Hendricks and Jim Wilder's book, The Other Half of Church. And they talk about the difference, one of the many things they talk about in that book is the difference between healthy shame and unhealthy shame, toxic shame. The kind of shame that we all, with every fiber of our being, try to avoid. Okay? The difference is this. Healthy shame says, look, that is not how we behave. Let's not do that again. Unhealthy shame says, you're a worthless piece of scum and you ought to just go throw yourself away. Healthy shame gives you a way back into community. Unhealthy shame leaves you trapped in feelings of guilt and worthlessness. And the ultimate result of unhealthy shame is despair. We've all felt it. We've all experienced it. That's where Judas is. He is profoundly ashamed of what he has done, but he has no way to make it right. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt, man, I really messed this up, and there is absolutely nothing I can do to fix it? The reason Judas feels that way is because the people who are supposed to help him find his way back to God, the people who are supposed to help him find his way back into fellowship with God and his people, who are supposed to say, all right, Judas, you messed up. That's true. You messed up. This is not how good, faithful followers of God behave. But we love you, and we're going to help you find your way back. No, that's not what happened. He was left dangling out there all alone. And of course, part of the reason is because these same religious authorities were just as morally compromised as he was. It's just they didn't care. And what about that Roman governor, Pontius Pilate? What about him? Well, there's cowardliness in him. Now, we don't know very much from history about Pontius Pilate. He gets very little mention from Roman historians. But we do know this. He had the power to do the right thing. He had the power to set Jesus free. Why? He's got all the swords. He's got the Roman soldiers behind him. We also know that he knew better. Now, Pilate knew better because his wife had told him, "Don't you have anything to do with that innocent man." We're in verse 27, or chapter 27 now, verses 11 through 26. She said to him, "Don't you have anything to do with that guy?" It's almost as if they had already been talking about the case. We'll come to that in a moment. He knows exactly who she's talking about. Why did she tell him that? Because she had a dream. Now, Roman culture did not accept the testimony of women. So it's not entirely surprising that he ignored her. But at the same time, Roman culture was also very superstitious. But Pilate knew better for another reason. The text tells us he knows why the religious ruling council had handed Jesus over to him. He knows why. He knows that it was out of self-interest. Well, how does he know that? Well, because he's got spies too. He knows what these people are up to. He has people who report back to him. He knows what they're really on about. Pilate knows better. He knows that Jesus is innocent. He even tells the crowd, "I'm innocent. I'm not doing this. I am washing my hands of this. If you want to crucify him, have at it. I don't care. But this is not on me." It's cowardly. He has the power to do justice, and he chooses not to because he's scared of the crowd, because he doesn't want a riot to break out. That's sort of like a guy with big muscles and, martial arts training being scared of a little 5'2" guy with skinny little arms, all because he just doesn't want to fight. Right? But then there is the cruelty of the soldiers. That's what we see in the rest of the chapter. Oh, I won't go into all the details of the torments that were inflicted upon Jesus, but they were horrible. They were really more horrible than most of us can imagine. And one thing that we have learned from military history is that sometimes cruelty is just cruelty. Cruelty is just inflicted because people enjoy being cruel. But sometimes it's not. The Romans, just like medieval Vikings, just like the Russian army today, the Romans used cruelty as a mechanism of social control. That's what they did. They exercised social control by being cruel to people. What the message is this: if you cross us, we'll do this to you. That's why they crucified you naked after they had beat you terribly. They crucified you naked next to a highway, so that people could see, oh, this is what Rome does to people who cross them. But there's another element at work here, right? There's another element at work. The soldiers who worked in Judea, in Jerusalem at this time, were not Roman by nationality or ethnicity. Rome didn't have enough able-bodied men to spread them all over the Roman Empire. So they used people from the local area. And in this case, they were probably Syrians from what we would call modern-day Syria. And it was called Syria back then as well. Okay? And Syrians had been at war off and on with the people of Israel for at least 1,000 years. Sometimes cruelty is an expression of ethnic animosity. It is an expression of hatred that one group has for another. Believe it or not, we take in more of the frustrations, the fears, the hates of people who are around us, people who are like us, than we want to believe. And these men have no reason to restrain their hatred, their cruelty, their violence. Do you see the contrast here? Maybe it's most acute here between the soldiers and our courageous, loving, insightful woman. She has no power, no social influence. And yet, as Jesus says, she has done what she could. These soldiers, and to an extent, Pontius Pilate, certainly the religious leaders, they have power. And they have either, in Pilate's case, chosen not to use that power to do good, or worse, in the case of the religious authorities and in the case of the soldiers, they have used their power to do evil. Now, in closing, what we see in chapters 26 through 28 is that Jesus' death is a microcosm of human life in general. Leaders fail to take seriously their responsibilities to those that they lead. Authority figures like the military or police or teachers or coaches or even parents sometimes abuse their authority to do terrible, terrible things. People who are supposed to be paragons of virtue will abandon the convictions that they said they believed, that they said that they once held dear. They will abandon these convictions that are so important to them, they claim. And what makes these instances of cruelty so painful, what makes them so clear, what makes them so dark and ugly, is that we also, as humans, experience rare and beautiful expressions of love, of devotion. Good and beautiful things happen to us. And what Matthew is calling us to, for all of us who follow Jesus as his disciples, for all of us who want to learn from him how to live our lives, how to be salt and light in a dark and tasteless world, what we learn is that we have a choice. Will we imitate Mary's example? Will we heed love's call? Now look, we're just like Jesus' first disciples. We'll talk about this later. Just like Jesus' first disciples, we're going to be cowardly sometimes. Sometimes we're going to fail. And we're going to have to come back to the Lord and ask him, please forgive me. I messed up again. And I'm so sorry. But when it really matters, will we choose to rise to the occasion of love's call? Or will we follow the mob? Will we give in to our most debased cravings? That's the choice that Matthew confronts us with as we think about these various characters. Who do we want to imitate? Whose story do we want to be told in and through our lives? That's what I want you to meditate on this morning and this week. What kind of story is being told through my life? But I also want you to remember that Matthew tells us these stories, and he tells us the story of Jesus, which we're going to talk about next week, to remind us that there is love, there is light, and that we can find it. In fact, Christ will bring it to us if only we will let him. Let us pray.